Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is Thomas Frank. He's a weekly columnist at the Wall Street Journal and the author of a number of celebrated books, including What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America, and his latest book, The Wrecking Crew, How Conservatives Rule. He's here to discuss both with us today. Thomas Frank, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
It's interesting because in your book, What's the Matter with Kansas? You talked about how Middle America does not tend to vote its economic interests, tends to vote with cultural wedge issues. I'm wondering, what do you think happened that made this a different election?
Didn't happen this time, did it?
Not at all.
Well, I mean, in some places, of course, it's still that still holds true. But the one of the things that if you read all the way through What's the Matter with Kansas, what it's about is this sort of culture war voter, this sort of red state mentality, the idea of working class people voting for conservative politicians who then do them a substantial amount of harm economically speaking. And there's no doubt that this actually happens or was happening for many. It has been going on for a long time in this country, but the reason that this is possible, the reason that it's possible for these sort of politicians, these sort of free market acolytes to attract the votes of working class people is because the other side doesn't raise, the economic issues that used to tie these voters to the Democratic Party. Okay, old school economic liberalism, old school economic populism, that stuff was gone. You didn't see it. I mean, Bill Clinton threw it overboard. John Kerry, you didn't hear it from him. You didn't hear it from Michael Dukakis. You didn't hear it from, I'm sorry, I'm even forgetting who their candidates are now. They're so, utterly forgettable. But by and large, the Democratic Party had abandoned that way of approaching voters until this election. Now, I think Obama had, by the way, whom I admire, quite a bit. He was my state senator when I lived back in Chicago. By the way, that's a story we can talk about some other time. That'll be, that'll be the Alcove part 2. But he was sort of heading down that same path in the early part of the campaign. You'll recall he was this sort of very high-flown, very noble rhetoric about bipartisanship, and then all of a sudden, he made this sharp turn to the left, beginning with the Democratic convention, and it accelerated once the economy started to fall apart in mid-September. By the way, here's a funny thing. You're from Canada. You'll find this amusing. Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll think this is absolutely horrible. So on around September 15th, one of the first days when the stock market took that ghastly plunge, like 700 points or something. One of the first days when that happened, I was on a Canadian TV program, okay? And it was a Canadian financial news program. And I thought they wanted me to come on and talk about the work that I did back in the early part of the decade about the stock market and the new economy and the stock market bubble, and take a kind of victory lap, and crow about how right I was. But no. They had me on there. The announcer turned out to be this kind of Canadian Bill O'Reilly, and he went after. He got me on there and just worked himself up into this lather, and get this, calling the Democrats un-American. Un-American, a Canadian. Why would he say that? Because because they believe in taxing and spending or regulation or something like that. I don't remember what the particular things were, but it struck me as very curious because he was a Canadian. Anyhow, this happened back in mid-September, and at the time, you'll recall Obama was well behind in the polls. And they kept rubbing this into me, like this was supposed to really, show me up or something. And so they kept reminding me of this, that your man is going to lose and blah, 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 blah. And it's once the economic issues come to the fore, as they did in this election, and they did in such a powerful way, and Obama responded so, perfectly, just pitch perfect in the way that he described what was going on. He just nailed it. When that happens, those same voters that I described in What's the Matter with Kansas, who are ordinarily motivated by cultural issues, tend to come back to the fold and tend to come back to look, economic liberalism remains to this day, although, we've had right-wing governments in this country on and off basically since 1980. economic liberalism remains to this day extraordinarily popular. It's something like 82% of Americans want some kind of, guaranteed health care like you have in Canada, That doesn't mean they're going to get it or anything like that, but it's enormously popular stuff. Once the Democrats come back to that language, come back to addressing those voters on the concerns that they care about, they're going to win. And they did.
So the question is then, what do you think happened with the Republican Party? I mean, you've got Obama, who seems to be giving some signals that he may be trying to govern from some sort of center with some of his cabinet picks. But what sort of a phase do you think the Republicans are now in? Everybody's painting it very black and making it seem that this is going to be years in rebuilding. But since they had been so successful in the last 20 years with strategists like Lee Atwater and then Karl Rove, do you think that they're going to go back to that?
Robert Norquist and Jack Abramoff.
Exactly, like you say in your book. But I wonder, do you think that they're going to go back to that sort of old school thing and, support somebody like Palin? Or do you think they're going to maybe try to now go to the middle, even though Obama seems to be trying to stake out that ground?
Well, one of the interesting things about the Republican Party, and this is, by the way, I live in Washington now, a sort of idée fixe, right? A fixed idea that you encounter in Washington that people can't seem to escape is the notion that the two parties are perfect mirror images of each other. And that if one party does something, the other party is automatically doing the exact same thing, on in its own way. But this is not the case. The Democratic Party has, for the last, for the course of my adult lifetime, been characterized by this sort of tendency to throw principle overboard in the pursuit of short-term electoral gain. Look at the career of Bill Clinton. Obama is an exception to that. Obama signals a kind of return to sort of old school liberalism, and I like that. I'm in favor of that. The Republican Party, on the other hand, has really been, it's marked by the way it has stuck to its principles. You look at something like Goldwater. They nominated this man that didn't have a prayer, and he took a shellacking. Like one of the worst defeats of all time. But did they give up? No. They kept on. They persisted until they got the right spokesman for Ronald Reagan to put the Goldwater issues across, and they came up with the right right way of approaching the electorate, the culture war issues that could win them elections. But always the vision remained the same. Attack big government, attack the liberal state, bring back laissez-faire, deregulate, do all these things. And they will stick with that no matter what, because that's their raison d'etre. That's what they're born for.
So even now you think they'll maintain that discipline and just do a new version of that? Do you think
there's no question about it. That's the reason they exist. The question is whether they'll hit the culture wars chord as hard as they have in the past. And I think my suspicion is that they will, for the simple reason that they don't have anywhere else to go. Look, their economic doctrine has been so manifestly discredited by the events of the last couple of years, going back to Hurricane Katrina, and then right up to this, incredible financial screw-up that they just allowed to happen. And we can go into that later, how this is, how they're responsible for this, how the doctrines of deregulation and, laissez-faire and let business run the government and all that allowed this disaster to happen. But yeah, their economic doctrines, already unpopular, are now just crumbling around us. The only thing they have left is the culture wars. There's no doubt that they'll go back to the culture wars.
So you moved to Washington in 2003, and in your new book, The Wrecking Crew, you talk about a lot of the incompetence and the graft and this kind of thing that you see in Washington. I'm wondering, can you give us a sense of who you're describing when you talk about the Wrecking Crew, and what sort of definition you're trying to provide of some of the privatization, a lot of the incompetence as you see it there?
Yeah. The idea of the Wrecking Crew was to provide a corruption theory for conservative government. We all, for years we've understood in America what liberal corruption looked like. It's second nature. You turn on the AM radio and there's Rush Limbaugh telling you all about liberal, the corrupt liberal state. But conservative corruption is an interesting thing. And like you say, I moved to Washington in 2003, and it immediately, or I guess within a year, the Abramoff scandal broke after I moved there, and then it was just one thing after another. It turns out that all these federal agencies had been handed over to people who were, opposed to the mission of the agencies. The lobbying industry was running amok. You remember the K Street Project? You had these guys like these, scoundrels like Tom DeLay running Congress, utterly brazen and unapologetic for what they were doing. And it's one of the most corrupt periods in our history. It rivals like the Harding administration. It rivals the Grant administration. And corruption is fascinating to me because it's not just a bunch of greedy guys grabbing at things. There's a logic to it. There's a meaning to it. There's a rhythm to it.
Is there an ideology to it?
And of course,
okay.
There you go, Mark. There's an ideology to it, and that's the critical thing, because the press by and large is inclined to just brush it all off as so much greed. It's people just grabbing, but that's not it at all. This stuff is ideologically motivated and, in fact, ideologically determined, and there is an ideological logic to it all. And that logic is the idea of turning the state over to market forces, letting market forces control the state. And conservatives have actually been pretty forthright about this. George Bush himself said early on in his administration, he said government should be market-based. And if you try to understand what he means by that, it's everything from letting lobbyists write the legislation, because lobbyists are represent industry in Washington, to turning over federal operations to the private sector through the process of outsourcing, and everything in between, setting up these sort of agencies that exist only to shoot down regulations proposed by regulatory agencies, like say the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, proposes some new clean air thing. Well, you've got this other agency in the government, and it's their job to zap the regulation that the EPA has proposed, and they answer, of course, to private industry indirectly. It's all indirect, of course, except for in certain cases. But that's where the corruption comes from. It is basically turning over the operations of the state to the private sector, making the state answer to market forces. By the way, can I add one more thing about this? Yes. This has been, however much you and I might deplore this, this has been fantastically profitable for the city as a whole. Washington, D.C. is now, I believe, the richest city in America. There is no recession there. There's a slight one in the housing market, of course, like everywhere else. But it's one of the few bright spots in the entire country. Conservative rule has been fantastic for Washington. It's become very, very wealthy, whereas back in, say, the 1960s or something like that, it was, well down the list of richest cities in America.
And it's interesting because you paint a very different Washington from the 30s, when the New Dealers, a lot of the very idealistic New Dealers, came to town. I'm wondering if you can just give us a sense of that, of the very sort of simple Washington that used to be there, a lot of people that wanted to work in public service, and then how and when that got switched to everything being privatized and expansion into Northern Virginia and that sort of thing.
Well, Washington has had booms before. It's in a boom period now, or it was during the Bush administration. But it's had boom periods before, and one of the most, the best known boom times for Washington was during the New Deal in the 1930s, and then during the 1940s during World War II. And it's one of the only cities in America where a lot of the housing was actually built during the 30s. If you go to I'm from Kansas City, there's no houses in Kansas City built in the 1930s, and just everything stopped.
Yeah.
But in Washington, that was a boom period, and they built this enormous amount of housing for the New Dealers, that was the name given to the sort of enthusiastic young people who were coming to Washington, D.C. to staff the new federal agencies that were being set up by the Roosevelt administration. And as I said, by and large, they tended to be young, they tended to be very idealistic, and they also tended to not get paid a whole lot. That's the nature of government work. It's not, you don't go into it because you want to get rich. You might nowadays, but you certainly didn't in the 1930s. And what I found after I moved there is there's this sort of characteristic architectural type that dates back to that era. These red brick pseudo-colonial or neo-colonial, I guess you would say, homes, built these suburban homes built in this ring around the core of the city, all built in that period, all built roughly to the same pattern, and they're not extravagant, okay? A lot of them don't have garages. If they do have a garage, like I live in a house from this period, mine isn't made of bricks, but if they do have a garage, the garage is designed for a Model A, you know?
Okay. Yeah.
And not for a Cadillac. And anyhow, but it tells you something about what the ideal was, what the Roosevelt administration was aiming at. Brick houses, which were, that was something respectable, but it was also something simple. Good public schools, a sort of planned community where you could, commute easily to downtown, that sort of thing. And this was a model for the development of D.C. that lasted up until the 1970s. And then all of a sudden, beginning in the 1980s, Washington it went grotesque. It went Baroque, and you start seeing these enormous piles built by the lobbyists in these gated communities centered around golf courses, and they're building a Ritz-Carlton suburb there right now. I've never seen anything like it anywhere else in America. I mean, look, you have the McMansion phenomenon everywhere you go in America. The giant overbuilding, but in Washington, it's just a little bit worse. Well, it's substantially worse, gaudier, bigger, uglier. If you're a purist like I am, I'll tell you, I went to college near Washington back in the 1980s, and I remember going into the city, and I spent a lot of time there, and then I hadn't been there in 20 years. And then I came back in 2003, as you mentioned, and the change was shocking. The gentrification of the city itself, but also just how fantastically wealthy the place had become in the intervening 20 years.
Well, it's interesting too because didn't the expanding suburbs in Northern Virginia, that must have played a key role in Obama probably winning Virginia?
Yes, it did. But that's a very interesting story too. Because the suburbs of Northern Virginia were, when I was in college and up until fairly recently, were reliably Republican. Fairfax County was Republican. I think they still have a Republican congressman, or one of their two congressman is Republican. Loudoun County, which is the richest, by the way, these are the number one and number two richest counties in America that we're talking about, Fairfax and Loudoun. Yeah, and Loudoun County, which is further out, had this sort of very extreme right-wing movement that kind of took over the local government for much of this decade. And then Prince William County, another extraordinarily wealthy county in Northern Virginia, had, some zany right-wing record that I didn't include in the book. I mean, there's only so much of this stuff that you can throw into a book and keep it interesting. But yes, Obama carried all of those places, which is extraordinary. That would never have happened 10 years ago. One of the reasons is, and this is a big reason, is you remember the election a few years ago when George Allen was running for the U.S. Senate. He was already a senator. He was running for re-election, and he taunted some kid. He called him macaca. Allen, teased him and said things like, welcome to the real Virginia. And this was somewhere, I don't know where, but it was somewhere outside of Northern Virginia, and basically made fun of Northern Virginia for, as not being part of the real Virginia. And this is something, by the way, that you encounter wherever you go in the rest of Virginia, this attitude that Northern Virginia isn't really part of it. Hell, you find the same thing in the state of Kansas. I'm from, the suburbs of Kansas City, and everywhere I go in Kansas, people are like, well, that's not really Kansas.
It's not rural.
Yeah,
real
it's not,
Kansas.
it's not authentic, sure, right? Sure. It's anyhow. So this is a huge mistake for Allen. He lost. Right?
And he ruined his career.
He ruined his career.
He's on his way maybe to the
And then the
Republican
McCain people
nomination.
come along and repeat the damn mistake. They almost to the word. They didn't say macaca. They didn't call anybody this, but they talked about the real Virginia versus the fake Virginia, Northern Virginia. It's like, wow, that's a smart move, guys, and they blew it. I mean, right there and then. There's also the argument that those. That the sort of the gentrification of Northern Virginia has, that these people are innately Democratic voters. I don't know how much I buy that, because it wasn't all that long ago that they could be counted on to deliver, for the Republicans. But everything is changing now. Who knows what we're going to see?
So with a lot of these corporate interests that you describe in the wrecking crew in Washington, that sort of thing, with a new Democratic majority coming in, with Obama talking about being so stridently against lobbying, how serious do you think that they will be in terms of being determined to push out some of these interests? Because as you've talked about, sometimes you wonder, are the Democrats really that different from the corporate side?
Yeah.
Because it would take tremendous willpower and a lot of vision at a time when this is such a challenging time for the country that you wonder how much human capital they'll throw at these kind of problems.
Right. I mean, it's certainly you'd think in the kind of recession that we're in that these issues would take a back seat. I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but let me say first of all that I'm generally speaking not all that optimistic that Democrats are going to be a lot better than Republicans. Now, at the same time, I don't want to lapse into the kind of cynical mistake that everyone in Washington does, where it's like, the politicians are politicians and they all behave exactly the same way. That's not exactly true. As I said earlier, I mean, the two parties behave in very different ways. And the Democrats are, as the political scientists would say, are cross-pressured by the fact that they are supposedly, the party of the people, and they're supposed to be against corporate interests and all that sort of thing. And so it's very unseemly for them to, to be selling themselves to lobbyists. And it always looks a lot worse when they do it than when, for a guy like Tom DeLay, who's all his life has been, talks about how great the private sector is and private enterprise and entrepreneurship. Of course he's going to, bring in lobbyists to help him write legislation. That makes perfect sense for a guy like him, but it wouldn't make sense for Democrats. Nevertheless, in the past, they have, shown themselves every bit the equal of Republicans in this kind of, the kind of making deals with lobbyists and stuff like that you see. Now, on the other hand, Obama is one of the handful of Democrats who gets these issues, who understands these issues. And he's already, he's one of the very few to talk about contracting reform. Look, let me take a step back here. Lobbying is part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that we have turned over the federal government to the private sector in the last 8 years, to this whole contracting industry that's based in Northern Virginia, that does things, that does the work of the federal government, that does the work of the public, but privately, and for a lot more money than the government would ordinarily do it. And these companies tend to be very well connected politically, generally speaking, to the Republican Party, because that's who gives them the contracts, and that's who's been in power all this time. And Obama is one of the few people in the Senate, or was one of the few people in the Senate who really understood this problem. Incidentally, another one was John McCain, but he sort of stopped talking about it once he got the nomination, But Obama understands this. Obama has already put into place rules for his, for the people that are going to take jobs in his administration, that's going to shut down what we call in Washington the revolving door, where people go from government into the private sector and back, serving the same corporate interests even when they're working government jobs. And he claims he's going to crack down on contracting. It remains to be seen whether or not he'll actually do it. Lord knows it needs to be done.
Do you think the tough economy will encourage that reform, or do you think that'll discourage it?
I think it'll encourage it because he has to make sure that every penny that they spend is spent in the right way.
So there is public will.
Right. Well, the thing is, what you've got right now is under President Bush, you had this enormous expansion in the amount of money that government spends. By the way, this is one of the reasons why the hard right is so angry at him, because they say this is an expansion in the size of government. In the Bush years, it's actually not an expansion in the size of government. The number of government employees, of bureaucrats, of civil servants has stayed the same, if not slightly decreased under Bush. But where all the extra money went was contractors. They've hired this incredible army of contractors. I believe they outnumber traditional civil servants by 4 to 1 in Washington right now. You've got them at every agency, EPA. You've got private contractors working side by side with federal employees, the private contractor naturally making a lot more money. You've got them at the Department of Labor. You've even got them at the Central Intelligence Agency. They're everywhere. They're sort of turning over the government to to private sector forces, and it has a problem of its own that's not just economic. The problem is, I mean, this is supposed to be a democracy. Public servants are supposed to answer to we the people. They're not supposed to answer to, he the boss, or they the shareholders, right? And that's what the case is. When you turn over government to the private sector, that's what happens. There's also fantastic waste that goes on. And we only know about this, by the way, anecdotally, because there's never been a comprehensive study of this stuff.
So you think some more will come out, certainly, about some of this waste?
I'm hoping so. Yeah. I mean, that's, I don't know if you're aware of this. I'm a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. It's this newspaper we have here in America.
I've heard of it, yeah.
and I've been calling several times, and I also call for it in the Wrecking Crew, that there has to be a comprehensive examination of the entire history of contracting out, of this policy of government by contractor, of private sector government. This has been going on since the early days of the Reagan administration. By the way, Clinton was just as enthusiastic about it as Reagan was. Bush has been far more, he's gone much farther with it than anybody, might have imagined. But the thing is that this whole thing started as on the grounds, it got its start on the grounds that handing everything over to the private sector was a way of saving money.
Yeah, somehow it's more efficient.
It was going to be more efficient, more flexible. It was going to be great, right? And it turns out, in every example that makes it into the newspaper, it's been this incredible botch. Everything gets bungled. You go over to the worst cases are all in Iraq, where they've decided to, Iraq is like it was going to be their test case for privatized government, right? We were going to let the KBR run this is Kellogg Brown and Root, subsidiary of Halliburton, is going to run the occupation of Iraq. Contractors are going to build all the new infrastructure of Iraq. And there's forever stories coming up in the New York Times about the reporter will go out to visit some site where they're supposed to build some new building for the Iraqis, and it's just a hole in the ground. And they've spent, how many tens of millions of dollars giving it to some contractor. The contractor's left the country. He's like, see ya. Thanks for the money. Bye.
Do you think one of the things I wonder is there sort of a hybrid solution where people always complain with government that it's not as efficient and yet it has the public good in its mind. Private industry is supposed to be more efficient, but it is a for-profit motive. Is there a way to combine the both so that you get a bit of a hybrid where things that you can privatize where it makes sense and it is actually more efficient and you can have oversight, congressional oversight, these kinds of things, you do that? What do you think about that?
Well, of course that could happen. Yeah, that's the idea. That's the theory. Yeah. The problem is oversight, as it is with so many of these things. When conservatives are in charge, is that the oversight has been totally closed down. And so we don't know what goes on with these contractors. We really don't. And I've studied it as probably more thoroughly than anybody else out there, except for people whose job it is to study in D.C. And there are people who, but we won't go into
there?
that. Okay. But I've studied it as thoroughly as you can, and there is no comprehensive accounting of this, and there's very little accountability. We don't, when a contractor, the people who are supposed to oversee contracting, that office has itself been outsourced, been privatized. Wow. Yeah, we really don't know. So look, if you can hold these people accountable, if you can make sure that they get the job done, yeah, sure, then you can do this in limited cases. And there's also, by definition, there are certain things that should not ever be outsourced. For example, I would think anything having to do with the Central Intelligence Agency, that strikes me as a very poor idea. But other people, it strikes them as a really goddamn excellent idea, and they do it and do it and do it. And look, the bottom line is that this has all been done for ideological reasons, and first of all, for ideological reasons, because you've got a bunch of people running the government now who believe in the private sector, who come from the private sector, and who believe that that's the best way to get things done. And second of all, because they are themselves political entrepreneurs. The people who are running the government are themselves profiting from this. They go back and forth through the revolving door. They work in government, then they go work for the contractor, right? And they solicit contracts from their old buddies in government. It's a whole industry that keeps this going, and the industry is, of course, it's good old-fashioned American entrepreneurship. And these people worship entrepreneurship. It all works according to their ideology. It's this colossal waste of money, but it works according to their way of looking at it.
One thing I'm curious, some describe you as polemical in terms of...
You can't say that,
Imagine
Mark.
that. Imagine that. Now, I would not, but some might. But I'm wondering, you do write for the Wall Street Journal, which is Murdoch's, paper and that kind of thing. But one thing I was wondering in reading some of your articles, your books, is it tough in a town like Washington where it has been, right-wing recently with Bush? Do you have a tough time with access? Like when you walk in the door, do people immediately assume that you have a point of view? Are they familiar with you and they say, look, I'm not going to talk to you because you're going to criticize me?
Yes, that was a problem. Writing this book, especially. I should say about me being polemical. Of course I am. I'm trying to write something that people will want to read. I'm trying to write something that's interesting. But at the same time, it is well researched. Remember, I've got a PhD in history. Yeah. I mean, it's all backed up with footnote upon footnote, and I've done an enormous amount of research, and I've dug through the Library of Congress, and and I've interviewed. Hell, for this book, I was interviewing people in South Africa and in Marianas Islands, and all these crazy places. I do the legwork. I'm a responsible reporter, or at least I try to be. And so yes, polemical, but at the same time, I get the facts right, or at least I try to. Do people not want to talk to me? Yeah, that tends to be a problem.
Right. Yeah.
I had a lot of people who turned me down when I started work on the project, who didn't want to talk to me. But I also had a surprising number of people who were happy to talk about this stuff. A lot of people will only do it off the record, or will do it on background or something like that. But plenty of people are proud of what they've done. You'll notice in the book, I interviewed Grover Norquist twice for this project. And you know what's really funny about that? He is a charming man. And I got along with the guy. He has a very interesting point of view, highly intelligent, and didn't try to sugarcoat his views or his deeds. He was, a fascinating person to interview.
In a couple of recent Wall Street Journal articles, you talk about how a cheap cynicism has brought us to disaster. And you also mentioned that it's time to give voters the liberalism they want. As I mentioned before, a lot of people are seeing Obama thinking that he's going to really try and stake out the center. Do you think that he's going to do things, big liberal agenda things like healthcare? How tough a time is he going to have with that now that they don't have the filibuster-proof Senate majority? It's an interesting thing with Obama. Some paint him as grossly liberal. Other people paint him as just pure, utilitarian, pragmatist. He's a cold Chicago politician. He's going to do what's...
Now, come on, I know better than that. I lived in Chicago for many years. He was my state senator.
Okay.
And when I lived there, I certainly thought he was a liberal. In Chicago, you have machine politics, and then you have I lived in a neighborhood called Hyde Park, which is where the University of Chicago is.
Where he lived, yeah.
Yeah, and Hyde Park was the one place in the city that persistently fought the daily machine. I mean, that's what it was known for. It would elect these aldermen who would stand up. It would always be these votes in the city council, whatever, like 30-1. And the one guy would be the guy from Hyde Park. It was always that way. The Hyde Park traditionally would elect very, very liberal people to office, and Obama was part of that tradition, that independent Democratic tradition. That is identifiably very liberal. Now, obviously, he had to make his peace with Daley once he became a U.S. senator, and especially once he started to run for president. And the question whether he's going to be a president of the center, or whether he's going to try to govern in a liberal manner, I think there's no question that he's going to have to govern in a liberal way, because events are forcing him. Events are forcing his hand. The comparison these days that's on everybody's lips in Washington is with Franklin Roosevelt. Also became president during a, really catastrophic economic chain of events. And Roosevelt ran, promising in 1932, promising a balanced budget, a bunch of other really, things that you would not think of, you would not identify with a liberal politician once he got into office. And in fact, he did some really dumb things once he got into office in his first couple of years. But events forced his hand. and the man, events and also I should say social movements, things like the labor movement, which was just getting going in America. It had been around for a long time, but was just starting to, the economic circumstances were making it more and more powerful and more relevant, and there were demands for for things like Social Security. There were all kinds of movements demanding solutions like this, just as there are today. You've got a guy like Larry Summers. He's brought him into the government. This is one of Clinton's deficit hawks, right? This was a deregulator from way back. And what are they doing now? They're going to launch this massive spending package. They're already talking. It's already dwarfing the $700 billion that the Bush people have agreed to spend. They're massive spending package, massive re-regulation of the financial industries, the very industries that the Clinton administration deregulated with some of the very same individuals that did the deregulating.
Yeah.
It's a great time if you appreciate irony. Yeah. And what's happening is that the center is moving very rapidly to the left, and I'm happy to see that happening. But I think that's what's going on in Washington, D.C.
So this idea that a lot of people say that America is a center or a center-right country, you think
they're just wrong.
Right. Now, do you think that they're wrong in this coming era, or do you think they're wrong in general?
I think they're first of all wrong in general. This country is a profoundly democratic country. If you look at our culture, and even if you look at the culture of the right, and I've studied I wrote the book "What's the Matter with Kansas" about the sort of grassroots culture of being part of the right-wing movement. Even the right-wingers themselves understand themselves as a form of rebellion against some kind of awful East Coast establishment. They speak the language of populism. This comes to us very naturally, even when you're on the far right, as these people are, and I think that what you're going to find is that the language of populism will return to its rightful place on the left, where it comes from. No, I don't think it's a center-right nation, and that's one of these weird media narratives that gets going. And there's a lot of people who have a vested interest in arguing that, because I was watching the networks and CNN on election night the same as you were, and watched commentator after commentator say this, and it's because they were just so utterly shocked and they couldn't figure it out. And what are they going to? It's still a center-right nation. It's like, sorry, buddy, look at the results. Your team lost. When you have an election, when you fight out the election on clearly on economic issues, liberalism is going to win pretty much every time. If the election is held on issues like health care and Social Security, privatizing Social Security, what a genius idea. And you go down the list and of these economic issues, liberalism is going to win. These issues are the liberal position on these issues is and has been for a long time enormously popular. That's not how, conservatives didn't get into office by saying, oh, we're going to deregulate the financial industry. We're going to make it possible to have these credit default swaps. We're going to turn loose the predatory lending. We're going to let all that stuff happen. That's not how they won power. The way they get into office is with things like the culture wars, or you go back and look at how Reagan won. It was because of things like the hostage crisis with Iran. How did Gingrich get in? Well, because Clinton had failed to deliver on national health care, and in fact had signed NAFTA, which was a Republican free trade proposal that's just deeply unpopular with the sort of Democratic core constituency, that is to say working class voters.
And also they always had that sense of an optimism, which maybe Obama, had his own brand of that. You think of Reagan's Morning in America.
Yeah.
And
yeah, well, that's just basic politics. Even in the darkest days, you look at Roosevelt. The guy kept the sunny disposition, and that's one of the reasons why Goldwater failed so dismally. Because the man was dismal. He was awful.
So you feel then that we are in a progressive era. How long do you think this is going to last? Let's say Obama gets 2 terms or something like that. Is a lot of the question of this how good a job the Democrats do in terms of ruling, that if they screw that up, that could go right out the window, or you believe that that's a natural thing that is sort of in the background regardless?
No, I think it's totally dependent on what Obama does. I think that the pendulum could swing right back unless he delivers. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that killed Clinton or that made the famous Republican Revolution of 1994, after Clinton had been in office for about a year and a half, was his failure to deliver on the basic thing that he had promised in the election, which was national health care. Give us national health care. And he got into office and he got beat. He came away empty-handed. And the voters look at him like, why are we voting for you? What is different? What's the difference between you and the Republicans? It's nothing except for culture war issues, And if Obama fails to deliver on these things that he's promised and that the country has clamored for now for years, if he fails to clean up Washington and get the industries back under some sort of regulatory supervision and do the sort of things that he needs to do, you're going to see the same thing happen. It probably won't happen as fast as, everyone knows that he's not responsible for the economic downturn, so I think he's going to get a free pass for his first couple of years, but he's got to act in his first 100 days. When he's going to be able to pass basically anything he wants. Look, he was swept in with a landslide, a larger majority than anybody has had for a long time. He's going to be able to do whatever he wants, and he's got to do it. He's got to have, he's got to deliver profound change and very quickly. And look, the Republicans know that they have to stop him, that they have to be obstructionist, that they have to, because delivering that change, if they can keep the Democrats from doing that, then the public looks at them and like, why do we vote for you guys if you can't deliver the goods like you promise?
So there's no way they'll go along with some of these things. You think
some of them will. Some of them will, and it's important for some of them to go. And I've talked to some people that are in the middle of these fights, like the fight over card check. This is a piece of legislation that's going to make it easier to organize a labor union in America. Right now, as you may or may not know, it's extraordinarily difficult to form a union in a workplace. And one of the pieces of legislation that they passed in the House, but not the Senate, and they're going to do it again in the next term, will make it much easier to form a labor union. Now, obviously, business interests are going to fight that with everything they got. Some Democrats believe, though, that they can peel off one or two moderate Republican votes in the Senate, and that's going to be enough to get it through if they can get more than 60 votes. It's amazing that we have to have more than you have to have a super majority to get anything real done in this country.
Right, which is all anybody wants anyway, to get stuff done.
Yeah. And I think you'll probably get a couple Republicans will go along with Obama on health care. I think there's no question about that. So I think he'll be able to deliver. I hope he is.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. Mine as well. And thank you very much for being with us. We'll see you again soon.